Obrigado. Before I get started, I'm going to wait for those guys to sit down. No, I'm being mean. Actually, before I get started, I wanted to give a word of thanks on behalf of myself and on behalf of you guys. So please clap loudly for Fabio and for Luis and for Cristian Diaz for making this possible this year. And we want to make sure that their work is appreciated so that they keep doing this for many years in the future. Eh? So I'm very happy to be here. This is one of my favorite places to come now. And after last year, you guys made me feel like such a rock star that I went out and I bought some rock star pants. So, I wear my hair messy. I didn't comb my hair today. And I had a lot of fun with my keynote last year because I was talking about having fun. I was talking about kicking ass, being energetic, doing things the Hashrocket way. And I don't know if you remember that talk. So how many of you were here? Raise your, oh, most of you. Good, good. So you remember I was talking about drinking, and I was talking about partying and doing shots. My colleague Lark presented at Occidente, and jumping in the pool as a group, doing this crazy stuff. But what I'm going to talk about this year is what comes before you have the luxury of being able to do all this stuff. Because while you can have fun and drink when you're poor, it's so much more fun when you have money. So the Hashrocket way applies to groups and to empresas, to the way that you're working in teams, not so much as individuals. But this talk this year is going to be about mastering the art of application development. This is for you as an individual. This is for you, hopefully, to reflect on what it's going to take to move to the next level and to ultimately become a master. But in order to do that, I'm going to go back in history a little bit to 1983 was when I first started programming. In 1983, I was in 3rd grade, and through the miracle of the U.S. educational system at that time, I was placed into what's called a gifted program. And in the gifted program, they had a whole bunch of these pet computers. And these pet computers, you programmed in BASIC. And I still have really early memories of my frustration with having bugs in my program, because the teacher didn't really know too much about programming. She would just give us a book and say, okay, you can use it from here. But of course, who reads the fucking manual, right? So you just start printing things. And if you had a syntax error, did anyone do BASIC like in the 80s? Do you remember what would happen if you had a syntax error? What would it say? No. That would be too easy. It would say redo from start. So what did you do when you got a redo from start? You started typing from line 10, so at the very beginning, and then you'd go all the way, and sometimes you would finish. And we also had an Apple IIe, and we got to program in something called Logo, which is still used for kids nowadays, and maybe some of you guys did it. And that was really cool. And in 1984, when I was in 4th grade, remember that I grew up very poor. I was the oldest of 5 children in a low-income family. And we got something very special in our house.
Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300. The Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard. With the Commodore VIC-20, the whole family can learn computing at home. Plays great games, too. Under $300, the wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Coming soon, Commodore brings you Gorf, the Wonder arcade game, and Omega Race in home versions.
So that was the Commodore VIC-20. The Commodore VIC-20 actually came out in 1980. I got it in 1984 from a garage sale. Do you have garage sales here? But I was very happy, and I did a lot of programming, and we used to record our programs to tape. So I actually did pair programming with my best friend. That was the first pair programming. So anyway, ever since that time,
It's 6
I've
o'clock.
oh, okay. I've understood that that software is essentially a creative endeavor. I didn't necessarily think about it in that way from the beginning, but it's always seemed like something that you did out of passion, something that you did in an artistic way. So what is the medium of software? Is it just code? I don't think so. I think there's actually a lot more things. For instance, if we're talking about application development in Rails, you know that these are the basic things you have to know to be able to program in Rails. But there's plenty of other things that constitute the art of application development in Rails. You have to know some OO programming, or you should anyway. What else is there? What came up there? Oh, Vim. We use Vim at Hashrocket, so you should know that, and Bash. And Photoshop helps if you're on your own, if you don't have a designer. And CSS and deployment and hosting and lots of other things, SSH, Cucumber, RSpec. It all starts stacking up. And if you're trying to describe how all these things fit together, how you become a master at all of these things, and how an application flows from you in a very natural way, in a way that really makes you realize that you're an expert in this stuff, can actually be pretty difficult. Michelangelo said of David, I looked into the stone and saw him there and just chipped away everything else. And as someone who, I believe, humbly, that I've reached a certain level of mastery, a certain level of expertise, it can be difficult to explain because sometimes we just look at the requirements for an application, we look at what we want to do, and all the steps in between don't necessarily come to us as we're an expert. We just understand kind of naturally what we have to do. But still, I want to try to examine this question of how you get to that point. How do you get to the point where you just look at a raw block of stone and see David there? How do you get to the point where you have just a brand new Rails directory that you just created, and yet you understand what's going to need to be there? Incidentally, I'm going to say that the things I'm going to talk about here have a lot to do with software craftsmanship. This talk is not about software craftsmanship, but I think that even though I'm using art throughout this talk, it's okay to describe application development as a craft, because good application development produces a result that is functional and beautiful, which is one of the definitions I found about a craft. But the talk's about application development specifically as an art. And I don't think you can learn it in school. Many of you have computer science degrees, I'm sure, are in school. And in school, they're going to teach you the fundamental basics of programming. And they're going to teach you languages, and they're going to teach you certain technologies. And depending on what program you're on, they might teach you some process. But in the same way that you don't need an art degree to be a successful fine artist, you don't need a computer science degree to be a fine application developer. And I'm not the first to think of these things. I'm not claiming that this is original at all. In fact, there's a book, a very famous book called The Art of Computer Programming by Knuth. Some of you may have seen this. But this talk is not about that book, or it doesn't really have anything to do with the book, because this book is about algorithms. This book is about how to program, and how to program well. And I'm not talking about beautiful code either. So I don't want you to get confused. I'm not talking about art in the sense of beautiful code. It's debatable whether this is beautiful code or not, but I think it's beautiful. Michael Feathers is a great guy. He wrote about legacy code. And he said, it's easy to get hung up on the balance and internal form of a system and forget that the structure is there to serve the goals of someone who is paying not for aesthetics, but for value. It is nice that what engineers usually appreciate as elegance has true value in a system with regard to maintenance and reliability. But some of these values may be taken out of proportion to what the customer needs. So I want you to understand that I'm not talking about the art of programming. I'm not talking about making beautiful code. That's a separate story. What I am talking about, finally, is practice and the importance of practice. Practice is universally understood to be the key to the mastery of any creative endeavor or any art. Whether we're talking about music or painting or even martial arts, whatever it may be, practice is what gets you to mastery there. So let's talk about the way that, for instance, in martial arts, they categorize the stages of your practice. And for that, I'm going to talk a little bit about shuhari, which is a Japanese martial arts concept. And this has been getting a lot of discussion in Agile circles, specifically in software craftsmanship. So this is the apprentice stage, shu, which means to protect or obey, and to learn the traditional wisdom. And I can't really see you because the light's too well, but don't be embarrassed. Raise your hand if you feel that you're an apprentice right now. Okay, so there's a fair number of you guys. And I assume that most of the rest of you are actually in this next stage, which is ha. Breaking with tradition, finding exceptions to traditional wisdom, reflecting on their truth. So this is the stage at which you begin to learn when it's okay to break the rules, when it's okay to go beyond design patterns, when it's okay to make your own. And this is actually the longest stage of your career, probably. This is where a lot of practice is happening, and then eventually, someday, you get to be master, or re. And at this point, you reach transcendence. And actually, in the explanation of this, you see that at this point, there is no technique, because all your moves are natural. Okay? Remember, we're talking about martial arts. And all your moves are natural reminded me of what Michelangelo was talking about when he said, well, I saw the block of stone and I saw David there. So there was a natural progression. He didn't have to break it down in his mind. And when do you know? I wanted to mention here that the first time that I had senior in my title, in my work title, was in 1998. This was like about 2 or 3 years after starting my professional career. Because I went from one job to another where the pay raise that they gave me dictated a senior position. And I was very, very, very proud of my senior position. Oh, I'm a senior engineer now. I know what I'm doing. I didn't know shit. It was completely false. Yeah, actually, I don't even know that many masters in person. One of the only masters in person that I know is a guy named Fred George, who works at ThoughtWorks. Fred has over 40 years experience in the industry and 20 years of experience doing Agile, and he's programmed in 60 languages. And this is him giving the keynote at Rails Underground. And I thought he gave a pretty interesting talk in Rails Underground that had a lot to do with the fact that he's a master, because what he talked about there, and you might be able to find it online, I'm pretty sure you can find it online actually. The talk was called Rails is a Hammer. And in it, he talked about using pure Ruby models, storing it to a persistence layer in YAML, and using Sinatra and Haml for the view. In other words, he completely disregarded everything about Rails best practices and just invented his own approach to how he was going to do his web app. And I said, yep, that's Fred. Pretty much just went with what felt natural. So it's someone that's a master, and it's someone who I know, because I've worked with him, that it has a high degree of expertise. Now, the concepts of expertise, I don't know if this has reached Brazil too much, but do you guys know who this is? The picture's a little bit small, but just yell it out if you know. Okay, so it might not be known too much here. Malcolm Gladwell. Okay, Malcolm Gladwell has been having a string of best-selling books. And his latest book is called Outliers, and it's really, really good. I got the chance to meet Malcolm Gladwell at PopTech 2008 and talk to him. And here he is talking about outliers. I think it was right before the book came out, actually, and this was his first PowerPoint. I thought that was kind of cool. And in the book, he talked a lot about expertise, and especially about the research of a guy named K. Anders Ericsson. And I'm going to be talking about K. Anders Ericsson a lot, because he's one of the world's preeminent experts on expertise. He's written a lot about it, and if you want to learn more about it after this talk is over, you can actually Google K. Anders Ericsson. I put the name really big there so that you can write it down and check it out. And there's a paper called The Making of the Expert that you can find really easily, a PDF of it. In the early 90s, Kay Anders and his colleagues did a study which was considered groundbreaking at Berlin's Academy of Music. They divided the school's violinists into 3 groups. In the first group were the superstars. These were the people that the teachers considered would be going on to great careers and playing in orchestras and having a lot of international renown. And in the second group were the ones that the teachers knew did okay, but they did not think that these people were going to go on to any particular specialness, to any particular great career. And in the third group were the people that were going to be music teachers in the public schools. So even at the Berlin Academy of Music, which is a prestigious school, there was a group that the teachers thought they just don't have what it takes. So they're going to end up in a teaching career. And then in this study, Kay Anders Ericsson asked all of the violinists the same question. Over your entire career, ever since you first picked up the violin, how many hours have you practiced? Well, it turns out that everyone had started practicing at the same time, 5 years old. In those first few years, all of them practiced about the same amount. From 5 to 8 years old, these students did not report any difference in their practice habits. But around age 8, real differences started to emerge. And those differences were by the group. Okay? The first group of people, the people that would be considered superstars that were going to go on to great careers, were practicing 6 hours per week by age 9, 8 hours per week by age 12, and 16 hours per week by age 14. Just think about that, 16 hours. Until the age of 20, they were practicing, that's to say, purposely and single-mindedly working on their skills with their instruments, up to 30 hours per week by the time they got to 20 years old. So almost a full-time job getting to that point. That was the first group, the group that would become superstars. What about the other groups? Whereas group 1 had reached 10,000 hours on average by the time the survey was conducted, group 2 had practiced about 8,000 hours, and group 3, the future music teachers, God bless them, had practiced a total of 4,000 hours, so less than half the amount that group 3 had practiced. So what did he do then? He did the same study. He did it with pianists. The same pattern emerged. And the interesting part about this study, it's all out there, you can read it, couple really interesting things that challenge our understanding of talent. One is he didn't find any naturals. He didn't find anyone in those groups who, by the luck of being born with an inside talent, was able to get to group 1, was able to get to a world-recognized stage of excellence without practicing that amount of hours. There were absolutely no naturals in any of the groups that were studied. What about the opposite? He was also not able to find any grinds, what he called grinds, that's in working really hard, grinding it, right? Grinds would be people, theoretically, who had worked harder than everyone else, so maybe 10,000 hours and above, but did not achieve the highest level of excellence. So there weren't unlucky souls out there that had no talent whatsoever, and they just worked and worked and worked so hard, and they still couldn't make it. It doesn't happen that way. And this, I found pretty groundbreaking. This challenged a lot of the rules that I've been brought up with, that I understood. And hopefully it's challenging some of yours now. Because it turns out that artistic endeavors don't really have anything to do with talent. In fact, when you look at studies like this, you have to question, what is talent? What is inclination? There's no magic in that. When you break down the evidence, you come to this number again and again. 10,000 hours. And 10,000 hours, if you're practicing something for 20 hours a week, works out to about 10 years. So, in study after study of composers, of basketball players, of fiction writers, everything that they did, that number just kept coming up again. And just to hammer this point home, you may have heard of Mozart. And supposedly Mozart was doing concertos from the time that he was very little, right? Actually, I looked it up, or was in Outliers. By the standards of mature composers, this is what psychologist Michael Howe says, Mozart's early works are not outstanding. The earliest pieces were transcribed by his father and perhaps improved in the process. Many of Wolfgang's childhood compositions, such as the first 7 of his concertos for piano and orchestra, are largely arrangements of work by other composers. He didn't write what is considered a masterwork until he was 21, after he had composed concertos for 10 years. What about Bobby Fischer, the famous chess master? He actually got to mastery in 9 years. So still very, very close. So like I was saying a second ago, 10,000 hours equals 10 years of practice if you average about 20 hours a week. And then I got to thinking, wow, this might have something to do with why I feel like my guys at Hashrocket are doing so well so quickly. Because we code 35 hours a week every single week of the year. And if you practice for 35 hours a week, how long do you think it takes to do 10,000 hours? Assuming that you take about 4 weeks vacation per year. Turns out it's 6 years. If you code for 40 hours per week, it takes 5 years. But I want you to think of yourself and your work habits at this point and ask yourself, how many hours are you actually practicing? How many hours in the day, or average per week, are you actually working on work? Are you actually working on coding web applications, if that's what you do, or any other kind of application development? How long do you actually spend doing that? Most of us are lucky enough to get paid to do this practice. And what do we spend our time on? Because I know that a lot of us here, certainly on my bad weeks, cannot get focused on actual work. And if we're good, if we know what we're doing, we can get away with doing actually less work than what is demanded of us, than what is expected of us. But if you know inside that you can do more, why not do it? Why not apply that towards our practice, towards our achievement of mastery? So practice. Practice, practice, practice is actually an expression in that way in English. And I'm sure some of you play guitar or piano or something and you understand this. Practice is not the monotonous repetition of the same thing over and over again. You have to know how to practice. That's why as an apprentice it helps to have a teacher, someone to guide you, someone to tell you what you're doing. There are myths about practicing. And for those of you that haven't practiced and reached a level of expertise in an instrument, I'll go over some of them. One of the myths is that practice makes perfect. You probably heard this. It's a very popular expression. Practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect. In the words of Al Woods, who is Tiger Woods' father, perfect practice makes perfect. Practice makes permanent. He actually said it the other way around. I was going by memory. Practice makes permanent. This has a very important significance to what we do. Because it turns out that the quality of what we're doing on a day-by-day basis when we're practicing has a lot to do with whether we're going to make it or not, in terms of really reaching the levels of Fred George and other masters in this industry. Because you have to be doing the right thing. We're all making mistakes. Mistakes help us learn. But one of the reasons that TDD and that the BDD and the practices that we talk about are so important is that as we go about our day, as we go about application development, if we're doing things the right way, then we're going to learn to do it the right way. But if we're constantly, I'm going to get into this in a second, if we're constantly doing the wrong things, it's not going to work. So you can minimize the mistakes by using the right techniques. So the second myth that I was getting into, in order to play fast, I have to practice fast. And if any of you guys play heavy metal guitar or anything like that, you probably understand exactly what I'm talking about. This is Lark again. Lark is one of the most amazing heavy metal guitarists that I know. He should be in a band. He should be touring around. He's freaking awesome. He's also pretty good at Guitar Hero. But the fact is that in order to play fast, you have to practice slow, especially if you want to be able to do very complicated things. And it applies to us. Why? Because what are we constantly being pushed to do by our bosses and by our clients and by our schedule pressure? Fast, 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 fast. Keep going fast, fast, fast. Well, you know what? It's difficult to go fast, especially when you're learning all the time, which we're constantly learning new things and incorporating them in. And unless you're already well along the path to expertise, if you try to practice fast, one, you're going to get very frustrated. Two, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Three, and even worse, you're going to retard your ability to get to that extra, to that great level of expertise that I've been talking about, because you're going to do the wrong things over and over and over. It's actually going to be a tax, if not a complete ruin of your expertise. Here's another myth that I think applies. I don't need to practice reading music, and maybe some of you guys, kind of taught yourself, just like I taught myself to program, and maybe a lot of you guys taught yourselves to program. And what about reading source code? Is there a parallel there between reading music and reading source code? I think there is. Because in order to practice sight reading, the ability to look at the notes and read them, you have to be able to actually read them, even if you're not playing them. As your sight reading gets better, as you're able to go through the notes and visualize in your head, imagine that you're playing it, you get faster and faster. And I think in a similar way, you can read your source code to get better. And there's source code out there. We have no excuse, right? There's such a quantity of open source code out there, from the Rails source code to today I twittered about the fact that EngineYard had released the source code to their Rails development directory. And if you go to the Rails development directory on EngineYard's GitHub account, you're going to find a pretty well-written app by Paul Thomas, which has specs and has cucumber features and is well-factored. And you could read that. You could clone it, you could download it. You could go through every file. As you go through those files, you go, what was Paul thinking? Well, what part of the application was he designing when he wrote this model? What was he thinking when he wrote this controller? Imagine yourself in his seat, right? Imagine yourself programming that. Go through the specs, the same way that a musician would go through music. So practice reading code. So, been talking a lot about music. I talked briefly about martial arts to begin with, and now I want to shift a little bit to a topic that's even closer to me, because even though I took piano lessons when I was about 7 or 8, I think, I don't remember very well, I hated to practice. My parents wanted me to play piano. They bought a piano, again at a garage sale. It wasn't very tuned, very well. My grandmother used to drive me like 45 minutes out of my city to go practice piano with a teacher that was about 90-something years old. And she would do, who studied piano? A few of you? Okay. So you're supposed to hold your hands a certain way, right? You don't go like this and you don't go like this. You have to hold your hands straight, and your fingers have to go down, and you have to get your knuckles moving. You can't just push with your fingers straight down on the keys. You have to move your knuckles, and that means that you have to keep your wrist straight. And you know what she would do to me? She had a sharpened pencil, and she'd put the pencil right here. So that if I dropped my wrist, which would make my fingers go flat, it would poke me. I hate this old lady. I hate these lessons. And then to add insult to injury, my younger sister, who was 2 years younger than me, who really sucked at piano, because actually I could play some piano, that I had taught myself, but she couldn't play anything at all. And she also had lessons at the same time, right after me, which meant that I had to go wait in the car with my grandmother while my sister had her lesson. These were prime hours of the day, from 3:30 to, like 4 something, that I wasn't out playing with my friends. So I hated piano, I didn't practice. But there was one thing that I always liked, which was art, in the visual sense, painting with acrylics. And actually in high school I got into an art major program which let me do a lot of art during the day. And one of my favorite things was painting with oils. And I think that there's tons of good examples that we can learn from oil painting in terms of application development. And since I don't expect you to be familiar with oil painting, because you usually don't get to paint with oils in school, you usually paint with acrylic or tempera. And oil paints are completely different. So this is a very famous painting called the Arnolfini Portrait by Jan van Eyck. And it was done at the end of the Middle Ages in the Low Countries, so the Netherlands and stuff. And the reason that this is an important painting is because this was happening at the time that oil painting was invented. And when you paint in oils, usually you do a sketch, and I chose this picture because you can actually see some of the sketch lines that's being done. And then you start applying the paint. And the paint is actually pigments in linseed oil or some other sort of oil. And those pigments are, for instance, sulfur for yellow or cobalt for blue, and as they dry. So right away, as I was researching the origins of oil painting and how you paint in oil, it occurred to me that we might be still grinding our own paints. And how would you be grinding your own paints as opposed to using the paints that are already prepared in order to paint your painting? Well, maybe you're the type of programmer that really likes to focus on libraries and frameworks and improving, plugins and things like that. And all of these things that go into our application development, there's kind of like the construction of the pigment, right? I'm going to get into that a little bit more. I don't want to get bogged down in that. Mostly to say that the paints are available, so focus on the artwork. And I think that if you get a beginner's set of oil paints and you put them on a palette, kind of like I described here, so blue, red, white, this is rails. This is just plain vanilla basic rails. So you can definitely get started with this, and you can produce almost anything. With everything that you see here, you can do pretty much any painting that you want. You're going to have extra work in mixing the paints and things, but then as you start adding things to your repertoire, to your studio, as you start adding knowledge of scripts and plugins and libraries that you can use and gems, and you start asking friends, it's kind of like your studio starts getting messy. So you start having paints and paints here and extra canvases. And this is what maybe my canvas looks like nowadays, because when I do a Rails app, I'm using Mongo Mapper, I'm using Formtastic, I'm using Access State Machine, I'm using probably about 50 other plugins. Everyone gets to this point at some point where they have their own palette. And just because you know the names of all the paints and the brush strokes and the styles, the things I was talking about that go into your palette, they don't give you an idea of the big picture. What gives you a coherent big picture is a sense of aesthetics. And that's actually what I was going for when I wrote my book. That's why I called it The Rails Way. I didn't want to focus so much on the tools, I wanted to focus on why. And actually, I don't know that I did such a good job. I'll be the first to admit it. I think what the book should actually be called is The Rails What. Because the book ended up not focusing that much on application development. It actually had a lot of reference material. That's okay. Rails Way is a catchy name. So what else can we learn? What about stretching the canvas? The question is, should you be doing it yourself? You can go to the art store and you can go ahead and buy all the supplies for creating your own canvas, and you might want to do that. But you know what? It's kind of a pain in the ass, and it takes a lot of time. You can also order or buy pre-made canvases. And the blank canvas is actually one of the most daunting, one of the most difficult things for an artist to look at. So if you're a writer, the most difficult thing to see is an empty editor screen. If you're a painter, one of the most difficult things to see is an empty canvas. And nowadays, I feel like if I just do Rails generate, you know, with a basic command, I just get my plain app. That's a blank canvas. So what do we have? We have tools like generators, basically, that can let you get started. What else can we learn? One is that the palette is not the point. So I see I see that my teams sometimes get very energetic and excited about all these different tools and, oh, what are we going to do this, and how can we advance Formtastic? Oh, we're going to branch Mongo Mapper. Oh, no, we're going to write our own Mongo driver. Oh, we're going to write another Mongo driver. Tools are not the point, but the point is what we create with them. It would be like a bunch of artists got together and they all brought their palettes. And they said, hey, look at this cool design on my palette. Look at how I've laid out the reds and the greens and the blues. Isn't that awesome? I can get to it exactly when I want to, right? You get what my drift is. The point is not the palette. How many brushes do you really need to paint a masterpiece? Do you really need to know about every single plugin that comes out, about every single gem that comes out? I mean, sure, it's cool, but how much does that take away from your time actually creating the masterpiece? And the answer is you might be taking too much time because of things like this, right? So I have thousands and thousands of unread blog posts because I subscribe to too many blogs. Actually, I think Twitter's been killing the blogs. So maybe that's not so much of a problem anymore. What's the process of painting like? The process of painting is iterative. So how does this apply? Well, what am I talking about first? An artist has a vision, but do you think the artist really, or Leonardo in this case, and I have to thank Jeff Patton for this series of graphics. He actually used it on his blog. So the artist thinks about the finished piece? No. The artist does piece by piece? No, that's not the way it works. The only time I've ever seen anything like that is if someone's copying a painting with a little grid system, right? It would be kind of like if you were starting a new app by copying your old app. So artists think about what they want to portray, and then they create a sketch. So they start to kind of get the composition right, and that helps them decide what they're going to build. And then they iterate. So they start filling it in. They fill in the areas of color. They continue. And when you get to this stage, some painters actually describe the sensation of having the painting talk to them. So as they're working on it, the painting's telling them where they need to go. And I think that's kind of like application development. That's kind of how when you get into the meat of the application starts kind of leading you by the hand and telling you where it wants to go. And eventually, you get to the point where you have a finished product. The thing is, if any of you paint here or work on music or do anything like this, or composing specifically, you know that the doneness is a function of how much time you have available. Because like I've worked on music myself, and there's some songs that I've worked for probably 40 weeks on, or I'm exaggerating a little bit, but weeks and weeks and weeks, because you continue doing every little detail. And oil paints are actually great for that because they stay wet. So over the course of days, oil paints can still be modified. You can come back and you can mess it up, and you can fix it, and then you can put more paint on top of it, and you can mix it, you can change the color, you can scrape entire sections off. And I was like, hey, that's just like Ruby. It stays wet for a long time. This was actually one of the things I didn't like about oil painting, is that it stayed wet. So I couldn't take it home to show anyone. I had to stay in the art studio at school. And since it was wet, I'd go back and I'd go, man, that leaf is not the right color. So just start changing it again, and now it's just going to take longer to get wet. So sometimes in application development, you need to say, it's good enough. I'm going to ship it. I'm actually going to put it out there. I'm going to stop messing with it. So Now I want to come back to something that I was kind of starting to allude to. I was getting ahead of myself. This is Christian Gottlob Gemelin, and you don't know who this person is, I'm sure, unless you look him up on Wikipedia. But he's actually a very, very important person in history. He's a professor, and in 1828, he was the first person to artificially develop ultramarine. He made a better blue. So before this doctor actually did this invention, it was very, very difficult to make blue. So if you go back to paintings, you'll see that there's very little blue in them because it was so hard to make. And if you go back to the clothes of that period, you'll see that there weren't any blue clothes because you couldn't make blue dye. But in 1828, he invented blue. Do you think that in the long run, do you think years from now, anyone is going to care about rails versus MERB? Do you think anyone's going to care about whether the Axis state machine is better than state machine is better than, you know, whatever else it is? Do you think anyone's going to care about Rails 3? The answer is no. They're not going to care. It's going to be just like this ultramarine, just like this better blue. Let's say Rails in general. Oh, that's so significant to us now. Look, we're here at a big conference. We're so excited. We're changing our workplaces, and we're using this to create great things. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, do you think anyone is going to care about Rails? I think what they're going to care about are the applications that we developed with Rails. So I'll ask the same question. Do you think 10 years from now anyone is going to know about Twitter or care about Twitter? I think the answer is yes, which is an application that was written in Rails. But that'll just be a little footnote. There'll be a page in Wikipedia. So the lesson here, the lesson that I take to heart, is to not get so interested in the intricacies of the tools that I'm using. I get interested in the application development. So when I don't want to be an expert in Rails. I don't want to be an expert in writing plugins for Rails. I don't want you guys to be experts in writing gems. I want you to be able to write them when you need them, but in the context of the great applications that you're writing with Rails. Still kind of continuing with this metaphor of art, and I alluded to this earlier. Do you need to go to art school to be an artist? The answer is no. And a computer science degree is not necessary for you to be an application developer. It wasn't for me. When I was in high school, I was all focused on my art. And if you go to my yearbook, you'll see I was like really moody, dark, you know, kind of just emo, they would say now, kind of kid. And I was surrounded by my paintings. I wish I could have found the picture to show it to you, but I didn't want to know anything about anything at that point other than art. And my father would not support my decision to go to art school. He wanted me to be a Jehovah's Witness preacher. He wanted me to go to Bethel, to be a volunteer, basically be a monk. And I said, no, don't want to do that. So I didn't go to school. I had to make it out myself. And kind of drawing towards the end, drawing to one of the most important lessons here, I got to point out this painting by Van Gogh, this self-portrait, is one of more than 2,000 works that he did in 10 years. Over the course of 10 years, he did 2,000 paintings before he went crazy. So, how many of you can imagine doing 2,000 apps in 10 years? I think all of ThoughtWorks, since we started Rails back in 2005, Carlos said that they've done 42 apps in Rails or something like that. So imagine individually doing that many apps. Imagine doing 1,000. Or imagine doing 100 apps in 10 years. That would be 10 per year, right? A lot of you won't even get to that point. So I draw inspiration from this. I think, wow, if I want to reach those heights, if I want to be as much of a expert or genius, like we said before, genius has nothing to do with talent, it has to do with practice, then I have to do a lot. So the lesson, the final lesson, and the point of this entire long talk is keep practicing. Keep reaching for excellence. Remember that rule of 10 years. Or if you're ambitious, remember the rule of 5 years. So if you can do an average of 40 hours of application development per week, You can reach it in 5 years. Think to yourself, when did you start practicing the same way, or the right way, I should say? When did you start practicing the right way? Because even though I can trace the origins of my programming back 23 years, or I can go back to 1995 when I first started programming professionally in Clipper with key-based files, that wasn't the right way. In fact, I don't think I started practicing the right way probably until 2001, 2002 maybe, when I was doing extreme programming in Atlanta. Maybe 2004, when I was doing pair programming at ThoughtWorks with people like Aslak Helisoy and Dave Estels. I think that's when I started practicing the right way, so that kind of resets the clock, right? So I look at it and I say, I'm not a master. I still have probably 3 or 4 years left. So I ask you guys, what about you? On your way to mastery, assuming that you care about being an excellent expert, the way I do, okay? Think about it. Think about how much work you have to do. The journey to truly superior experience, truly superior expertise, is not for everyone. So even though I'm giving this talk here, I'm realizing to myself, some of you just don't care. Some of you just want a good job, right? But to those of you that do care about this, look at what you're doing. Decide to change for the better. It's an active choice. There are no shortcuts. Just because you're using Rails, just because you're so excited about it, it's not going to give you that magic. It's not going to give you the specialness that you need to be able to jump in front. And if it's going to take you at least 5 or 6 or 10 years or maybe more, then what are you waiting for? Thank you. That's my talk. I'm going to be blatantly commercial here and say, you can actually buy my book in Portuguese. So I recommend that you do. And if any of you are able to, or if any of you have it here, I'll sign it for you as well. So, Fabio, I don't know if you want me to take questions. I'm happy either way. Does anyone have any questions?
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on. I think I'll warm up with one question.
Okay.
Okay, I want to do a question about this. Because I usually already have an answer for this, so I would like to know your take on that. Because some people will say, and I hear that a lot, that's why I have an answer for that. If you practice for like 40 hours a week, because everybody's ambitious and wants to get to the 5-year period, and they're going to say, no, I can't do that because I need to have entertainment. I don't want to work all the time because this is work. So what do you say to people that think like that?
I say that's fine.
Exactly.
Well, think about it. That's fine, right? It's like that's part of what I was trying to end with.
Yeah, because I mean, they say this in a way like, you're wrong. This will not work.
So here's the thing. Maybe you guys can use. So if you're like me. So if you care about excellence and you have control of who you work with, and some of you do, then you can do what I do at Hashrocket, which is I don't want to work with anyone at all for whom it's just a job. I am an elitist prick. I am. I want to work with people who have passion. I want to work with people that are working towards excellence. I don't even want to work with clients for whom it's just a job. Fuck the enterprise. If you want to do just a job, go work in the enterprise, go work for the Brazilian government. And then you can do maybe 45 minutes of programming a day, and your boss will be happy. And I don't know this for real, but I've been told. But you know, it's the same way in big corporations in America. This is not something unique to Brazil or any other part of the world. In the bell curve of talent, which goes this way, right? The bell curve of talent, the vast majority are average. That you can't avoid that. And the average people are not really going to want to put in that much effort. But part of what I love about Rails and the Rails community, and part of why I was turned on by Rails in 2005, and when I saw DHH, and when I got to meet him, I said, this is a guy that wants to change the world. This is a guy that wants to make the world better. And he was probably the first person to say, fuck the enterprise a while back. You know, Rails is a tool, Rails is a palette, in the language I was using here, to make great masterpieces, to do amazing things. And sure, you can do enterprise apps with it, and you can do common apps with it, and you can probably make good money. And you might not think it now, but I guarantee you that in about 5 years, there will be tens of thousands of Rails developers in Brazil. And there will be tens of thousands of Rails developers in Argentina. And if I have anything to do with it, there's going to be tens of thousands of Rails developers in Chile. And this is good, because this creates the environment where we don't have to justify, we don't have to push as hard for our decisions. You're able to just walk in and the way I do and just say, well, you want a web app? We're going to do it in Rails. Of course. It's the most excellent thing out there. But the answer is, you know, there's lots of average people out there, and it's perfectly fine. I don't hate these people. I don't want them to die. They can play their video games. I wasn't always focused on excellence. I played a lot of Counter-Strike when I was married. It's one of the reasons I'm not married anymore. All right, if there's questions, I can take another one, or there might not be, huh? Yeah.
Obie, you mentioned Twitter in your talk, and you have Twitter in your last slide. And there's a product out that is very good for the Twitterverse. And I wonder if you could plug the Twitter blocker app for people here. Because I think it's good for the community.
Thanks. The question is, could I plug tweetblocker.com? Which is an app made by us at Hashrocket. Sure, I can plug tweetblocker.com. So what tweetblocker.com does is lets you give a grade to the people that follow you, so that you can block the ones that are spammers, and it's kind of considered a good thing. But we're actually thinking about open sourcing it. So this might help some of you that are thinking about doing Twitter apps. Make sure you have a revenue model. You know how much TweetBlocker costs per month? It's like over $1,000 in hosting, because it's very popular. You know how much money I make from TweetBlocker per month? 0. So it's a very expensive marketing exercise for us, and I've been thinking of taking it offline, or just having the API support for Tweety 2, which is connected to it, and maybe just open sourcing it so that people can build their own tools on it. Mr. Question. Always consistent.
You were talking about how it's important to start creating more programs and not focus on the tools. And I know you have the company Hashrocket. You work for other clients. How much time do you spend in your company producing programs for yourself and for internally?
There's no set answer. The answer is we're a consulting company, so when we're not doing paid work, then we have extra time to work on our own tools. And we do that. It's for practice and for fun, but with an emphasis on the apps, right? Not everyone thinks this way. I'm not even saying this is absolutely the correct way to think or anything like that. Take it as my personal opinion, and maybe some of you agree with it. But application development's where it's at. And some folks, maybe like Matt, I don't know, we'll talk later, but he likes working on tools. He likes working on MERB and Data Mapper and stuff like that. Matt's here somewhere. So, right? Do you think application development's where it's at, or versus tools, or? I can always count on Matt to be contrary. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people like working on all sorts of stuff, and maybe you're going to be the one that invents the next ultramarine.
No, I was just saying that
I'm here. Rob. I was just saying that different people have different needs, and they like playing on with different tools and fix different problems. So.
Yeah, and there's different areas of expertise as well, right? So here I was talking about application development because that's what a lot of these folks get paid to do, and it's very rewarding to make your living that way. But if you're a hobbyist, or if you're an open source enthusiast and you like working on open source, or if you're in a company you're lucky enough that pays you to do open source, or then great, get awesome at the art of open source, of tool building, let's say, because tool building is an art as well. Bobby? Sure. No more questions. Thank you very, very much. Really enjoyed this. And I look forward to drinking with all of you out there.